Thank you, everybody who has shown up here in person and everybody who's tuning in on the live stream. My name is Enrico Bianco, and I serve as the Neurodiversity at Work lead for Special Needs Network. For those of you who aren't familiar, Special Needs Network is a company-wide employee resource group. We're about 800 strong by the Google group numbers, and we cover a wide range of topics. If you identify as somebody with special needs, or as neurodiverse, or if you have a friend, relative, or somebody else who you are caring for who falls into that category, or if you are simply interested in knowing more about how to be an ally and improving things within the company, we are your group. And this is one of a number of talks that we've had in our Special Needs Network speaker series, and we're really excited to host this talk today. So when Florida Friends was a young girl, she decided that she wanted to write a book. And she compiled her experiences growing up autistic and her artwork into a book called How to Be Human, The Diary of an Autistic Girl. And now she is stepping out from behind her pen name to readdress the world as herself, Georgia Lyon. And so, on behalf of Google and the Special Needs Network, please join me in welcoming Georgia Lyon. So to start off, what motivated you to write How to Be Human?
Well, I'd always had a dream of writing a book ever since I read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone at age 7. So I would say the biggest motivation for me was just I really wanted to get that life goal done. But I think as I was writing the book, I sort of realized, hey, my life could actually help other people. The things I've been through could actually help a lot of other people too in ways that I'd never really thought about before. I'd only really thought about my individual experiences with autism, but I'd never seen how it could tie to other people and the collective, I guess, autistic experience as a whole. So through writing the book, I saw that, and I think once I actually had the book published, I was like, well, that was actually a good reason to write the book too. Not just for myself, but for others.
Right, and how did you come up with the pen name, Florida Friends?
Well, I guess Florida came from the fact that my first name is Georgia, so I just thought of it as being in like a different state of mind, and that pun was totally intended, by the way. And then Friends, I just chose because it's spelled differently, but it's a pun off of the word, like, friends, plural, because so much of the book is about emotions and social skills and the stuff you would need to make friends.
Right. And so now, as a young adult, you wrote that book when you were how old?
Well, I wrote it officially when I was 15, but a lot of the artwork I did back when I was 8.
Right. So that was at 15, and now as a young adult, you're stepping out from behind that pen name, Florida Friends, and reintroducing yourself to the world under your real name. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired you to do that?
The only reason I really had the pen name originally was because I wanted some privacy while I finished high school. As you probably know, high school around here is very rigorous, and I needed a lot of energy to be able to focus on my academics and learn as best I could. And I felt that if people knew I'd published a book, well, first of all, I would just get a lot of attention for that. Second of all, I wasn't sure if that attention would be completely positive, knowing how kind of immature high schoolers can be. So when I published the book, of course, all my classmates were 15 too, so it's not exactly the best age. But I guess what's motivated me to step out now is that, you know, obviously I've graduated high school, I'm about to go on to college. I don't care as much if people know private information about my personal experiences or if they judge it, because I figure if they have time to judge me, then they probably should be doing other things with their life. And, you know, it is what it is.
That is a good philosophy, definitely. So when and how did you learn that you're autistic?
I learned at age 7 when I was watching this show called Dogs with Jobs. It featured dogs helping people with various things, you know, search and rescue dogs, dogs for the blind. And one episode featured a dog who was helping a boy with autism. And I looked at that boy, and in many ways he was different from me, but I noticed one similarity, which was that when he got excited, he flapped his hands like I did when I was excited. And after watching the show, I was eating a snack, and I just kind of casually asked my mom. I was like, "Mom, do I have autism?" And there was just sort of this pause. And then, a little surprised, she said, "Yeah, you do." And that was a bit of a, I guess, shock for me. I mean, I'd always kind of sensed I was different, but just to finally have a word for it was definitely, in some ways it eventually was a step forward, but I think at first it was kind of a step back, because I wondered if she hadn't told me because there was something seriously wrong with me. So that was not a good feeling to have initially upon finding out I had autism.
But further to that, actually, how did learning that you're autistic sort of affect the way that you thought about yourself and others at that time?
I think at that time it made me feel like I was somehow lesser than others, or others couldn't really like me because I had some like weird disability or disease. And you know, when you're 7 or 8, you do want to be like everyone else, but so that made it hard. But I think over time I sort of realized that I do have challenges, but other people do as well. And while they may face different challenges, just the fact that everyone struggles with something is sort of something that connects me with the rest of humanity. So I think over time it allowed me to actually empathize with people more.
Right. And speaking of challenges, what do you think were the most significant challenges that you faced growing up autistic?
Understanding my own emotions was definitely one, and understanding the emotions of other people. If you can't do that, man, the world is a really scary and confusing place. But I guess what helped me with that was just, I did a lot of artwork with Sheila. She's in the room, but yeah. Back there in the nice red tank top. And I think doing that artwork kind of allowed me to slow down the whole process of social interactions, because, you know, usually they happen very quickly. It's sort of lightning fast. You have to be able to read many small cues, micro expressions, etc. But when I was doing art, I could have time to kind of look at what I was creating, really think about it, attach something tangible to what otherwise might be abstract and chaotic thoughts. And through that process, I learned how to understand emotions. And once I understood my own emotions, it was much easier for me to feel in control and have enough, I guess, bandwidth in my brain to try to understand the emotions of other people too.
That's really fascinating, actually. So how did you pick up or learn your social skills? What methods did you find worked best for you?
Well, as I already said, a lot of drawing and just talking about social situations with either my therapist, or once I was a little bit more advanced with my social skills, the friends that I managed to make. But I really wish there was a better way to say this. I think there's just a lot of trial and error. You know, for those of you who've read Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell says that if you want to become an expert in something, you need 10,000 hours of just brute force practice. Well, that's the best way to learn how to pass as a neurotypical, is just brute force practice, lots of trial and error, and some rather embarrassing moments.
I wonder how many hours you've accumulated overall then in deliberate practice at being social. I think that number might be a little bit staggering for myself too. So as a teenager, how open were you with others about being autistic?
I was pretty open with my friends, honestly, my close friends at least. With just casual acquaintances, maybe not as much, and not always as open with my teachers, but I think I was open with the people I really cared about and who I felt would just like me for me, and then for people I wasn't as sure of, you know, whether they would just like me for me or how they would view me, I wasn't as open. But I never exactly hid it. It just wasn't something I would publicly declare. Like, I wouldn't just run into a room and shout, "Hey everyone, I'm autistic," you know? But I mean, if they saw me flapping and figured it out, I really didn't care.
Right. And what are your thoughts on disclosure now, actually?
I think it's a very nuanced subject to be perfectly honest. I don't think there's one formula for when to disclose or how to disclose. You kind of have to just go by what you feel comfortable with. And I think within the autistic community, some people will feel more comfortable disclosing about their autism than others. Personally, I generally, as I said, disclose to like my friends, whatever acquaintances I feel comfortable with, my teachers, sometimes if I feel comfortable. But, you know, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model for disclosing.
That's very true. I've found that to be true of myself as well. Sometimes it's just something you have to figure out on a case-by-case basis. So what challenges would you say that you face presently because of autism?
For me personally, it's mostly the sensory overload aspect of it now. I feel in general that I can read social cues a lot better than when I was younger, but it gets very hard when there's a lot going on in the environment, especially in noisy environments. I seem to have more sound sensitivities than I think a lot of people who are quote unquote this high functioning on the spectrum. But I think, yeah, that's the main part. Just going into a new environment, almost having this physical need to like look at everything in there and just take it in before I can even really interact with people or fully enjoy myself. Just the constant stress of always having background noises like voices, doors closing, fans. I'm just using various examples of noises I actually hear in this room, which is fairly quiet. But, you know, obviously in other environments like in high school, oh man, there was just constant chatter, even during tests and stuff. So that was rough.
I can sort of identify with that. The one that I'm really noticing right now is the way that the room is lit.
Oh, yeah.
The lights overhead as well as the sunlight coming in from the window. So yeah, I don't think that I have maybe all of the sensory integration issues. It's very different for everyone, but it's definitely noticeable. What advantages would you say that an autistic mind has afforded you?
I think it's afforded me the ability to be a bit more rational. So for example, back in middle school when most people are catapulting between extreme highs and lows emotionally, I was able to kind of stabilize myself by thinking of life this way. So if I had a day and some good stuff had happened and some bad stuff had happened, I'd be like, well, this part of the day was good, this part of the day was bad. If I averaged the two, it's an average day, and just kind of move on with life instead of getting caught up in the emotional back and forth of everything. And then I think another big one has been just, it's allowed me to have very strong morals, because I'm sure many of you have heard that autistic people are very black and white thinkers. And I think when it comes to sort of ideals, that can be a good thing, because I know it allows me to be like a loyal friend, because there's just some rules that I follow when I'm with my friends that just mean that, you know, I'm just kind to them when I'm around them, or try to be the best friend I can be. I try not to get caught up in like the social drama or my own kind of project my own emotional turmoil onto them, unlike some people do, unfortunately. And I think it's allowed me to be a strong student as well, because generally I'm very honest with my work and I don't plagiarize or cheat or do stuff like that. So strong morals. And then I think the final one, which many people seem to think is actually a deficit in autism, is empathy. I really think that having autism and having the experiences I've had has allowed me to be much more empathetic towards people who are just outsiders in any way, shape, or form. Like, I just remember during my middle school days or even my early high school days, if I was talking with someone and we were, you know, hitting it off and everything was going great, but a third person came up and was sort of awkwardly hanging on the outside of the group, not sure what to do, I would always be the one who'd be like, so what do you think of this or that? And I would kind of bring them into the group, because I just remember so much as a young child when I was like 6 or 7, I would always be the one who was hanging on the outside. And I just knew how bad that felt. So I just wanted to give them a leg up if I could.
That's a really interesting point, because there's sort of this meme that autistics do not have or cannot express empathy, coming from the theory of mind research from Simon Baron-Cohen, as well as other stuff that derived from that. Could you say a little bit more about that, actually? Like, how do you feel about that statement, that autistics do not have empathy. Do you think that's true, or?
I really do not think that's true at all. I think that many autistic people are actually very empathetic, and the main problem is not so much that they lack certain ways or certain neurons or certain ways of thinking as much as actually those neurons or ways of thinking are hyperactive. So it causes a state where the person just shuts down because they're so overwhelmed by sensory input or emotions that they just can't express it in the ways that most people would think of as being empathetic. But I think really when you're inside of it, when you feel what's going on, you realize that you feel other people's emotions and that they're affecting you. You just can't convey that well. I just remember as a kid, sometimes I would almost be like an aerial for emotions, where if I would go to like a class, for example, and everyone there was feeling tired, even if I entered the classroom feeling energetic, by the time I left, I would feel tired or sad or whatever other people were feeling. So no, I don't think it's true. I think it's almost the opposite, where you have to learn how to like separate yourself from others sometimes in order to function.
And there is something to that, the so-called overwhelming world theory. So in your book, you describe yourself as an empowered autistic. For those that haven't had a chance to read the book, tell us a bit more about what that means.
To me, what it means is that while you have autism, you can still lead a very successful, fulfilling life just as you are. You don't need to change anything about yourself or the way you think. And obviously there may be some areas where life will be a little bit more difficult, but you'll also have the ability to see things in a unique way that will add a lot of richness and depth to your life if you're an empowered autistic, I think, and share that with the rest of the world as well.
Right. And what advice would you offer to autistics that want to empower themselves or their allies?
Well, to autistics who want to empower themselves, I would say, I think, be flexible. I know this is not something a lot of people necessarily say in the neurodiversity movement, but just learning how to think like a neurotypical can actually be really useful. I think that some autistic people are afraid that if they learn too much about neurotypicals, if they, do quote unquote therapy, that they'll somehow lose the autistic aspects of themselves. And I don't think that's true. I think it's just simply opening your mind to a new way of thinking, not necessarily that a better way of thinking, just a new one. And it'll give you more kind of options for how you think. It's kind of like, the way I like to describe it to people is it's like learning a second language. You don't forget your first language, you just have a greater vocabulary now to speak with more people. And so I think that autistic people should be open to learning how to think like neurotypicals, learning about certain forms of body language, facial expressions, and whatnot. And I think in terms of allies, I think the allies too have to be flexible, but in a different way. They have to have the flexibility to let autistic people direct them, because some autistic people will want to learn more about neurotypicals, and some will just want to be themselves as they are. And I think that if an autistic person expresses the desire to learn more about neurotypicals, their ally should help them do so. But if they just want to be as they are now, their ally should also respect that wish and let them do so.
That's really fascinating, actually, and kind of uncanny, because I know that I've described being autistic internally as being sort of like a learner of a foreign language. And a good friend of mine actually put it really well. He said that being autistic is like being a foreigner in every culture. And it really feels like it's true sometimes. Speaking of that, actually, how does it feel to interact with other autistics as opposed to interacting with the neurologically typical?
I notice slight differences, but to be perfectly honest, I think there are more similarities. I don't actually notice a lot of differences. I notice when I'm interacting with autistic people, there can be slightly less eye contact, or sometimes they'll have their stims, rocking in a chair or flapping a bit. But honestly, I feel like there's just a lot of diversity in the neurotypical community too, more than most people I think realize. And there's also a lot of diversity on the autism spectrum. So really, when it comes down to it, the interactions are more determined by the individual than their diagnosis.
Right. And what sort of, I don't know if I would call them coping mechanisms or adaptations, have you learned to make when interacting with the neurologically typical?
Personally, for me, I have my hand grabbing. I guess you can't really see it here, but I kind of often go like this in class to, or wherever, to stop myself from flapping if it, because that helps. Because, you know, sometimes I don't want to be flapping everywhere, or I kind of have learned to very consciously make eye contact with people. Like right now, for example, I'm not doing the typical stage thing where you just look at the back curtain and you pretend that you're making eye contact with everyone by secretly looking over them. I'm actually kind of looking at everyone in the audience. And then I think the other big one is just that if I'm not sure, I observe before I enter a situation.
I think that's actually pretty interesting, because I remember I was talking with another autistic, and she looked at me and she said, "Do you think that I'm looking you in the eyes?" And I said, "I think so. I think that's eye contact." And she said, "Actually, I'm looking right here," is what she told me. And this was like her mechanism for giving eye contact, or at least the perception of it, but without becoming overwhelmed.
Well, personally for me, I actually do give eye contact because with my other sensory issues, I actually find that it helps me. So if I can't hear someone, looking at their face and just seeing how their mouth moves can actually be very useful. So I think that a lot of my teachers think that I'm really just paying very attentive attention in class, when really I just want to hear what they're saying like everyone else. But everyone else can kind of look away and be like, whereas I have to actually look at them in order to kind of understand what they're saying with my sensory issues.
So in her TED Talk, actually, or in a number of her talks, Temple Grandin talks about different types of thinkers on the autism spectrum. She herself identifies as a visual thinker. As she puts it, she has Google for images in her head. Mm-hmm. She also talks about the math and language types, who are really good at perceiving patterns. Where do you think you fall within those classifications?
You know, it's really interesting, because I think when I was younger, I fell more with the visual thinkers, but around age 7 or 8, I actually did a lot of therapy because I was having a lot of issues learning how to read. So I think through all that intensive therapy, I really developed a lot of strong neural networks for language thinking too. So now I don't think I neatly fit into either box. I'm sort of a mumbo jumbo of both.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask actually if you had noticed your ways of thinking changing over the years. Have you?
Yeah, I think I've definitely become a bit more of a language thinker over the years. I never quite got into the whole mathematic thing. I don't, like, math still doesn't really work with my brain in general, but I definitely have become much stronger with language. A little bit less strong in terms of visual skills, though I still have decent ones, I'd say.
So your book, How to Be Human, it's not just a simple diary, it also includes your artwork. Tell us a bit more about that artwork. What does that mean to you? What meaning does it hold, and how does it fit into the subject matter of the book?
The artwork in that book was a lot of the artwork I originally did to understand social skills and my own emotions. So it's just very valuable to me, because that was really when I had my big breakthrough. I feel like kind of before that, I'd been sort of isolated in my own kind of glass ball of autism, and that artwork was really the pickaxe which allowed me to kind of break out. But I think the meaning, yeah, that's basically the meaning it holds to me, and why it was really, or that was why it was so helpful and whatnot.
That's really fascinating. Actually, I'd love it if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. In what ways did your art help you to sort of learn to, quote, be human?
I think it helped me, as I said before, because it allowed me to slow everything down and kind of take it at my own pace, instead of having to be thrown into the middle of a social interaction that was too complex for me to understand while it was going lightning fast. But I think it also just allowed me to get more in touch with my own emotions too, and kind of see that I had them and that I could understand them, as opposed to it just being something that was foreign and complex.
And do you still draw today?
I draw a lot less than I used to, I must admit. Generally, I write more, kind of.
So in what ways do you feel you express yourself now?
I express myself much more verbally, I would say, whether it's through my writing or talking with my friends. I mean, I do still like to draw, but unfortunately I do not generally make as much time for it as I should. So if I do need to express myself, it generally is with words, now that I have a stronger understanding of what words I can use to actualize my emotional vocabulary, shall we say.
Right. Tell us a little bit more about that, actually. Like, how did the writing and the drawing help you to sort of navigate your own emotional state?
I think it kind of, as I said before, it allowed me to have or express kind of abstract thoughts in concrete ways, and especially the drawing aspect. And then in terms of just writing the book, I think that allowed me to really think about my life's experiences as a whole and see a way to define autism for myself more, because as probably many of you know, certainly there's a DSM, 5 definition for autism, the diagnostic criteria, whatever that is. And while I think it helps to create groups and then deliver some help to those groups, it doesn't allow for much kind of individual depth. It doesn't really have the human aspect to it. So I think writing my book allowed me to see the human aspect in autism more in myself, and then later on for others.
Right. And so How to Be Human is, in a way, a children's book, right? But do you expect that there's something to take away from the book for an adult audience, like, say, the one that we have here for this talk?
Oh, definitely. I think the takeaway for pretty much everyone is that we're all different. We all kind of struggle in different areas, but fundamentally that's part of what makes us human, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that, and we should, help each other with it and learn from each other's experiences instead of, I guess, shutting each other down.
That's very much true, actually. Do you feel that you still have difficulty like making and keeping friendships, professional networking relationships, and things like that?
Well, I don't do much professional networking at 18, but yeah.
It's never too late or early to start.
Certainly. But no, I don't. I think now I actually have a lot of long-lasting friendships, the longest of which is my friend who I've been friends with for 15 years now. So no, I really don't. In fact, I'd say I just have more difficulty making new friends, because generally in new situations there's a lot of more sensory information to take in and a lot more to learn. So that's still where I kind of struggle the most. But in terms of maintaining, once I've learned how to recognize facial patterns and certain body language things in a person, I'm pretty good at figuring out what the person is feeling and maintaining their friendship if I care to do so.
Tell us a bit more about yourself. Like, what do you like to do with your leisure time, hobbies, and so on?
Well, I like martial arts. I did Taekwondo for about 7 years, and
I see we've got a fan.
woo! Those who kick together stick together.
I didn't know that was a saying. That's really cool.
Well, it is. But no, let's see. Now I'm doing karate, though, just for a change of pace, and that's also really fun. I like swimming as well, just kind of casual swimming. I started that when I was 3, because apparently I jumped into a pool before I knew how to swim, and my parents can give you the full story if you wish to hear. But then I also like to read a lot, and let's see, what other things? Yeah, and social, I guess, justice issues are really interesting to me at the moment as well. Just everything from neurodiversity to women's issues to issues including racial minorities, the LGBTQ community, all of that stuff.
So what else do you do sort of in the area of advocacy for autism or for other related social justice or disability issues?
So while I was still in high school, during my final semester there, my school founded this club called the PSA, which was the Pinewood Social Awareness Club, and I did a lot of advocacy with them, and we had an assembly just to generally educate on learning differences and racial issues and women's issues and a lot of other issues as well. I also just do a lot of interviews to help advocate for autism and autism awareness. And yeah, I would say that's about it so far, but I hope to do more in the future.
And who would you say are your biggest influences?
I would say probably my family and friends. So my parents, the people I've known for many years, such as Sheila and my other autism therapist, and just many of the wonderful friends I've made along the way through high school and whatnot.
And anybody within, say, the wider autism community? Authors, people who have spoken?
I really like Carly. If you've ever had a chance to see any of her videos, she, I think, was originally diagnosed as being quote-unquote low functioning, but it turned out she really did have a very great understanding of the world and much depth to her thoughts. And she has this wonderful video called Carly's Cafe, which I think explains sensory overload basically better than anything I've ever seen. And she's a wonderful person, I think, that I like to model myself off of.
That's a really good video, actually. And I have read Carly's Voice, and I highly recommend it to everyone here. I think there's a lot of maybe controversy around Carly, some people who may be on the fence about whether they believe that she's actually expressing herself through her writing. But I think that if you look past all of that and just let what she's saying in her posts, in her book, in her videos speak for itself, it says a lot about the experience of being autistic. So do you still write? Are you maybe thinking of writing another book?
Yes, though I think it will be in a different genre this time. I'm thinking of venturing into fiction and kind of exploring some other writing ideas I've had. I don't know necessarily if I'll write another book about my life anytime soon, though.
I was wondering if you have any advice for autistics in the workplace who may be having trouble fitting in with their working group or having issues with their manager. How would you advise that those people sort of advocate for themselves and get those problems solved?
Well, I would say that they, if they're in a position to do so, should be honest about having autism, first of all. I think that shows management and other employees that you're confident and self-aware, which are very attractive qualities to most employers, I would say. And I think that they just need to let other people know when something is not going their way. Like, they don't have to necessarily be rude about it. They don't have to interrupt what's going on. But, just later talking with their manager or other employees to try to come up with strategies to cope better in the future, or just, even just, having the ability to maybe break for 5 minutes in a quiet space where they can decompress, I think would be very helpful. And then in terms of the other employees, I think that they just need to be very clear about what they're doing. They need to make sure that they have clearly set guidelines and expectations, because I can say personally from my experiences that autistics are not very good at determining what you want from very murky instructions. I know that's a struggle for everyone, but I think it's more so for people on the spectrum. And
it's kind of funny because navigating ambiguity is actually like part of our job description as software engineers at Google. And it feels weird sometimes, like being expected to do something that I know that we're so weak at. But we try our best, right?
Indeed. I mean, I don't think that navigating ambiguity is necessarily a strength for anyone. It's just more difficult for those of us on the spectrum. So, I'm sure that definitely, I think that's one of the issues that people who are neurotypical can relate to the most, I think. But
that's a true point.
Yeah, but I think the other big thing for employees is just, to be very flexible and be willing to listen, because I think when you're in a majority, such as the neurotypical majority, you kind of think everyone else thinks like you, and that's not always true, and it's sometimes hard to imagine anything different, but I think you just have to be open-minded about that.
That's all really, really good. Thank you. That's actually a lot of stuff for me to think about as I continue to advise Special Needs Network and the company as a whole in neurodiversity in the workplace. And with that, I've definitely run to the end of the questions that I had. And so if anybody in the audience has questions for Georgia, I believe we have a mic up on the podium here.
Thank you so much for coming and talking about your experiences. Any advice for parents of autistic children?
I guess my advice to parents would be the same advice as I gave to just allies in general, which is just to kind of be flexible and see what your child wants and needs. I think don't be afraid, though, to do what you think is right for your child. Also is a big one, because I think some parents feel as if they have to follow what other doctors or therapists say, because those are the quote-unquote professionals, but probably you know your child better than any professional really can with just X number of hours of assessment. So you have to do what you feel, I think, is right in many cases, because while other people are trying to help, they just don't have the same understanding of your life and your child's life that you do.
So building on that a little bit, like in what ways did your parents support you as you were growing up?
I know they were very important in helping to find therapists that I have or have had throughout my life. For example, I know we started with some just general kind of social skills therapists that weren't necessarily hurting me, but they weren't necessarily helping me develop my social skills any further. So after a couple months, they just changed course, even though those therapists were from some program that did ABA, which was considered kind of the mainstream at the time, and I think actually still is considered the mainstream treatment for autism. But instead, my parents switched over to Sheila and another therapist named Sarah, who did not do as many mainstream things. They did more kind of Greenspan playtime, which was actually more beneficial for me because it was more dynamic and more about being flexible and learning patterns in social situations quickly and learning how to kind of be creative along with it and play pretend. So I think that was very important.
Something like social role play or
Yes.
guidance in social situations. Yeah, I remember there was something like that when I was a child as well. My mother put me into this program that brought children together, and we either role played social situations or we just had guidance when interacting with each other as to how to, I guess, socialize better with each other. And that was really actually valuable for me growing up.
You spoke a lot about things outside of your education that have really helped you, things like artwork and some special people in your lives, your parents being so supportive. But I was wondering about successes that you've had in the classroom, specifically with like teachers or maybe programs at school, and if there's anything that through, I'm not sure specifically where you go to school, but are there things like programs that have helped you grow as an individual or just through education?
That's honestly hard to say. I was homeschooled from first grade to seventh grade, so I would say that's why a lot of my experiences came from sort of outside an established school program, because we sort of created our own school curriculum during those years. And then by the time I went back to kind of more of a regular form of school in 8th grade, my autism, while still there, wasn't preventing me from learning in the same ways it had in the past. So I didn't necessarily participate in a lot of special programs or even get accommodations in middle school or high school. So I don't honestly know. But in terms of successes I've had just inside the classroom, I would say generally I generally made A's in most of my high school classes. I took some AP courses and did pretty well on the AP tests in general, and I got along well with most of my teachers. I think I can't actually think of any teachers that hated me in high school, so that's probably an achievement in and of itself.
That's definitely a positive. And were group projects a lot of a problem, or?
Group projects were kind of a logistical problem, but not so much with the social skills. It was just basically that I define hell as coordinating more than two people's schedules to get together at the same time. So, but the social skills part was actually fine. I'd say, in fact, in some of my group projects that I was more socially and emotionally mature than other people in them. So it was mostly just about not getting caught up in whatever their drama was when such issues arose.
As a quick extension. So a lot of us, I'd say all of us in this room, went to school a while ago, right? We were in high school, you know, decades potentially ago, depending on who you talk to. But I was wondering if you think that in the event that you do need accommodations, or maybe friends of yours that do need accommodations, do you think that that you have everything that you need? I think a lot of us probably felt that we didn't always have the accommodations that we wanted. I was just kind of wondering about the way schools work now.
You know, there's still definitely issues with that. I mean, I can say I know, actually, you're right, I do have friends who have accommodations. One of my closest friends in high school did, and, you know, I'd say overall it was okay for her, but there were some kind of hiccups or awkward moments. Like, I know, for example, on some standardized tests, they don't give you necessarily breaks if you have accommodations, so you have to really know how to pace your own time, and often people don't, so they can end up with kind of awkward amounts of time. Like, they'll take 20 minutes on one section of like the ACT, and then they wind up with an hour at the end of the whole thing, and they're like, well, now I have an hour to do a section that's really only going to take me like 25 minutes. So there's hiccups like that, or there's just people who don't, I guess, understand accommodations. You know, some people still definitely think that if you get accommodations, you're just getting a leg up on everyone else, and so they'll put you down for that, or, you know, teachers won't really follow the accommodations they're supposed to give. So, I mean, I think it's heading in the right direction, but there's definitely still some progress to be made.
Yeah, so do you feel that today your autism still, because of it, you view things or people or events in the world differently from other people?
I think sometimes yes, but sometimes no. I don't know. It's very hard to say. As I said before, I think there's a lot of kind of diversity amongst people who aren't autistic, because even if they're not neurotypical, they could still have other so-called differences, ADHD, emotional disorders, etc. So it's hard to say. I think in general, I view things in the same way as a lot of people my age, kind of, or who've gone through similar life experiences. But I think the big one still for me is just sensory processing. That's really where I think differ in the way I perceive the world from a lot of people, especially when it comes to coughing. That's one sound that really drives me absolutely nuts. So I think, you know, most people, if they enter a room and there's someone coughing, they don't care. And for me, I'm just like, can I get out of here as soon as possible, please? And I'll try to kind of do so if I can.
Do you have any advice for someone who's making, say, online products that could make it easier for an autistic person to access? Because around here, we're big fans of making information universally accessible and useful.
Oh, gosh, I don't really know, honestly. I mean, I think that a lot of autistic people are quite savvy on the internet, to be perfectly honest. Not to buy into the nerdy engineer stereotype too much, but I think that's definitely a large portion of those who are on the autistic spectrum. And so, I mean, I think probably if they want the resource, they already know how to find it, would be my big piece of advice on that.
Thank you so much for talking today. It's been really, really wonderful to hear your insights. I wondered if you had anything to say to how society as a whole views autism. So, of course, recently, it's been something that's been very much talked about, and not just in the research community and in society in general in an innocent way, but there have been parents who have been not vaccinating their kids because they think that this is somehow going to give them autism. There have been a lot of similar paranoias and scares, and what would you say to make people, to put people on a better path, I guess?
I guess what I would say to that is I want them to realize that autism is not a tragedy in and of itself. I think for many people it really is just a different way of thinking about the world. And I think people have to realize that, well, one thing I've noticed too, just in society in general, is there seems to be this idea that if you have autism, that you're going to be kind of extremely smart but lacking in empathy and unable to really socialize or want to be with other people. And I think people have to stop perpetuating that stereotype. It is really just not true. I've seen it in so many movies, so many TV shows, and I think it's starting to really stick in people's minds just outside of the scientific community or the community of people who actually know people with autism. And it's something I really try to speak out against. For example, with movies such as what was it? The Imitation Game, I thought kind of perpetuated that stereotype a lot and kind of got on my nerves. But I think what you have to realize is that or what society in general has to realize is that there's a lot more diversity on the autistic spectrum or on the autism spectrum than anyone can really describe, I think, because each individual has a very unique experience with autism. There's no one-size-fits-all for autism. I mean, I just know even talking with Enrico, even though we're both fairly similar in our experiences, we definitely have areas where we differ. Like I have definitely more sensory processing problems, it seems, than he does. Or, for example, earlier when we were talking about various sensory things, I noticed all the sounds, but he was the one who noticed the lights, which I didn't even notice. So, I think people have to realize that autistic people aren't always the scientists kind of huddled at the edge of the room. In fact, for me, I would actually say math and science are kind of hard. So, and that verbal stuff is easier. So I think there just needs to be, I think that autistic people themselves have to be allowed to speak more to their experiences, and that those should be those should be considered more valuable than whatever movies portray autism as being in general.
But expanding on the portrayal of autism in the media, would you say that there are any examples you can think of doing it right?
I would say so. I mean, I think one movie I saw that did it really well was Temple, which was based off of Temple Grandin's life experiences when she was younger. And I mean, I think in that case, it really showed her with a lot of kind of compassion, and it showed definitely the challenges she faced. It didn't try to downplay those, but it showed to how she was really able to make very unique contributions to the world, not just because she was autistic, but because she had this very special passion for helping animals as well. And I think another example I've seen, it's fictional, but I think it's well done, is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. It certainly does feature an autistic boy who's very into math and science, but I think it also shows him in a very human light and a very compassionate one, and it shows how he's really able to find, I guess, independence in spite of all the challenges he faces.
Indeed. And I think it's actually important to point out that this meme that, say, autistics are sort of hyper intelligent in one particular field or endeavor can sometimes be a little bit damaging because we're not all savants.
No, we really aren't.
We really aren't. And so it can feel kind of bad to have sort of your value as a person defined by whether you have this, incredibly unique and highly developed talent. Like as if for some reason maybe you're not so valuable unless you have savant level talent with numbers, like Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man. Yeah, I caught you there. And so I think it's important that we add all of our stories to this tapestry of understanding about autism. So that was definitely a very good question. Thank you for asking it, the gentleman back there who did.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I was wondering, going back a little bit to the beginning of the talk, you mentioned how finding a label to describe yourself was useful in some ways, but you've been very ambiguous about your relationship to labels in general throughout this entire talk. Could you just comment a little bit more on the putting people into bins of autism, on the spectrum, neurotypical, etc., and how that affects the way you view the world?
Yeah, I think, well, I can say personally what the label means to me. Personally, I have no trouble with the label with autism when referring to myself. But I think in terms of just labels in the wider world, I think they're somewhat flawed in many ways, I will say, because as you were talking about, we have labels such as neurotypical, autism, autism spectrum. But those labels are I guess, often applied in a very precise way that actually doesn't help a lot of people. For example, I know that in order to be diagnosed with autism, basically what they do is they give you a test, and if you get a score above a certain number, you have autism. If it's below the number, you don't. Now, obviously that can be challenging because let's say you need a score of like 20. Well, if you're a 19, you're probably going to be facing a lot of the same challenges as a person who is quote unquote on the autism spectrum. But you wouldn't be able to get the same help and support as them, and you wouldn't be able to really explain it in the same way to people. And so I think in that way, labels are very kind of limiting. I think the reality is that even though we use the term autism spectrum, it really is just a spectrum of human brains, and that the autism spectrum is part of that, but it flows into the spectrum of what's considered quote unquote normal as well, and that there isn't necessarily one great way to define what autism is, where it starts, where it ends, what is high-functioning autism, what isn't high-functioning autism, what's just normal, someone maybe just being an introvert. So I think my relationship with labels in general is not as positive as it is when just using labels for myself.
I want to get back to the question that the gentleman back here asked about products, because you and I have a relationship, and you may not remember how difficult it was for you to access online information when you were younger, and that you had a lot of help, but not everybody has that help. I mean, I know that it was very visually confusing for you, that knowing where to click and where not to. So thinking about it from that aspect, do you have a different answer about what products might have been?
I mean, I just don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know, honestly. That's the honest answer.
I guess it might be hard to remember.
Yes, it's hard to remember sometimes.
For me, like my mother gave me a computer really early on, and that was something where I just explored on my own, and I learned by myself. And so my mother was very sort of hands-off about that. She definitely worked to give me the tool and to I actually remember she built a computer from parts, and she learned how to do this because she wanted to be able to do this for me, which was really super awesome of her. But when it came to exploring the World Wide Web, and back then we had bulletin board systems and so on, she generally just set me off and supported me when things went maybe less than good, but was otherwise willing to let go and just let me explore. And I think that was really useful.
And I think that goes back to the diversity. Many of the children that I work with are exactly like that. They could be on there exploring all day, but some people don't come to it naturally.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah, they always say that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic
exactly.
person.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so with that, we'll close. And I want to thank again everybody for attending here in person and watching the live stream. We will have a recording available later. Thank you very much.